One of the things I've emphasized the most when talking to my peers about world building, and especially with fantasy, is making your world feel lived in. It's a big concept, but one of the most important ones for having your audience accept your world and feel like they're living in it and experiencing it for all that it is. We haven't really done a general world building video for a minute here on JBat, so today I just wanted to hit you guys with something that should be useful no matter what you're making. Fantasy, sci-fi, novel, tabletop RPG, whatever. There's no genre that is injured by being more immersive. The core idea of believability or immersion in a fictional verse is that it is something that requires a bit of a light touch. It's like lighting in a movie. You only notice it when it's very good or very bad. But especially when it comes to immersing your audience in a setting, you want them to just be immersed, not thinking about whether or not they are immersed. It's a case where you are trying to motivate your audience to feel something, which can be tricky, but despite the nebulousness of that definition and the degree to which those kinds of things can be finicky to accomplish, it's not actually all that hard once you know what kind of methods you can use and learn to wield them. The first of those is part 1, minor characters that have lives. This one's quite obvious as soon as you hear it, and the trick here is mostly in the execution. While your protagonists are your main characters, that doesn't mean the rest of the world they live in revolves around them per se. And even if it did, that doesn't mean that the other people living there know that or even care. The people around them, though it'll be setting dependent of course, are basically just going to be going about their everyday lives, and more or less are not going to care about your upstart adventurers unless they're given a reason to. So, whenever such characters are portrayed, even if in effect they're only an accent of the setting, it's worth thinking deeper about their own whys and hows. For example, if two of your protagonists meet at a bar to exchange information and you want to include some banter or small talk from the patrons, think about why they are there and what kind of a bar it is. Perhaps in a more technologically advanced setting, it's centered near some sort of truck stop, and it's pretty late in the evening. A few truckers trickle in here or there, just want something to drink and relax after ending the day 2 states over from where they started it. One of them, just off a 600-mile voyage, sits down next to your protagonist, bags under his eyes, and orders a local draft beer. He sits down at the bar next to your protagonist with his beer, and as he goes to take a sip, he spills it. It splashes all over your protagonist. And now, how is this new character going to react to the situation? Is he going to be tiredly apologetic, offer to buy your protagonist a drink, or help get some paper towels, or is he going to lash out? Obviously, you're going to be thinking about how your protagonist reacts, but it's important to think about the other side of the interaction too. Whatever the reasons are for what this bar goer does next, the audience is going to know if you thought their actions through, much more than if your only thought was having someone spill beer on your protagonist to inconvenience them. When you think about the goings-on of your world from other perspectives, you'll find yourself writing much more believable scenes. A great example of this would be that famous coin flip scene from No Country for Old Men. This is, in many people's minds, one of the best scenes in the entire movie, and I'm inclined to agree. Conceptually, though, it almost shouldn't work. It's all about whether or not Anton Chigurh will kill this random gas station attendant. I mean, sure, we don't necessarily want him to kill anybody, but the attendant is just a movie character, one that doesn't even get a name. So why should we care? And yet, as the scene plays out, we find ourselves caring a lot more than we expected. We're feeling the tension with the attendant as he finally resolves to call heads on the coin. And why is it that we care? Because with just a few scant lines, he becomes a real person. He inherited the gas station from his wife's father and moved out to attend it after he raised his family in another town and basically retired from that life. Now he's basically just an old guy in his golden years, and he shouldn't have to do anything all that stressful or difficult anymore. And yet here he is at the end of the gun barrel that is Anton Chigurh. This is believability, immersion, an effective use of a minor character. It reminds us that these people live in a world that continues to revolve around the sun day and night, so to speak, where people live and die, and selling that illusion to your audience is invaluable. As for doing this yourself, it essentially comes down to making your minor character stop feeling like a proper setting piece and like a part of the story in as few words as possible. We don't want too much from the gas station attendant type character. It'd be weird if he'd have ever shown up again, for example, and it's pretty important actually that he doesn't. One of the key tricks to pulling this off is making your minor character important to someone else. It doesn't even matter if that someone else has any stake or presence in the story whatsoever. It's not like the gas station attendant's kids or wife show up anywhere in the story. They are, in a narrative sense, literally just words in the air. They don't exist in any meaningful way, but the idea of them, the concept that if the attendant is killed, these people will miss him, causes us to empathize with him so much more strongly. Of course, your minor character isn't always on the end of a gun, and having him talk about his loving family in an otherwise innocuous or mundane situation is probably not going to be the right call. In those kinds of cases, you might want to focus on giving them something else, and that is a purpose. What are they doing and why are they doing it? I mentioned the guys in the bar earlier were truck drivers, because even just by giving them an occupation, we've suited them up with plenty of concepts about what their life is like and what we might expect from them. We know what the truck driver's job is, we know that it's hard, we know that he's away from home, which does a lot of the work for you with very little actually required on your part. So that, I suppose, is the general idea with this way of creating immersion. In brief, setting up minor characters who have their own lives will remind the reader that their characters are the only ones under the spotlight in an otherwise full stage, and that the world is wide and populated. However, this isn't the only way, and sometimes you can't rely on minor characters, and that's where we get part 2, environmental storytelling. While it could be argued that environmental storytelling is more prevalent or important in entirely visual media, I'd say it remains crucial even if all you're working with is the written word. So no matter what you're making, environmental storytelling is always going to be a useful tool in the toolbox. And really, what is environmental storytelling other than allowing your setting to speak for itself? To keep up with the theme of my main man Cormac McCarthy, The Road, and I mean the book and not the movie of course, is phenomenal for environmental storytelling, and that is for 2 reasons. The first is that McCarthy could make the back alley behind a Walmart into a mysterious and interesting place, and the second is that he had to do so for a story like The Road. There are so few characters in the book, especially those that talk, that it really is the setting that's in contention most of the time. Hell, it's through the environmental storytelling that we get one of our biggest hints that this unnamed apocalypse that ended the world is some sort of nuclear winter. This is most emphasized by just how gray the novel is, and just because I can, here's a quote. "He walked out in the gray light and stood, and he saw for a brief moment the absolute truth of the world. The cold, relentless circling of the intestate earth, darkness implacable, the blind dogs of the sun in their running, the crushing black vacuum of the universe, and somewhere 2 hunted animals trembling like ground foxes in their cover, borrowed time and borrowed world and borrowed eyes with which to sorrow it." Honestly, if all you get out of this video is a pitch to read The Road, that's fine, but just be emotionally prepared. It's a very impactful read. Anyway, the common maxim, show don't tell, is the most concise way to explain why environmental storytelling is so effective. You are showing the audience the world and allowing it to speak for itself in a way that, when done thoughtfully, isn't forced nor unnatural. But to make this more concrete, follow me through this example. In a fantasy-esque world, our old friend protagonist Von Generic, who we haven't seen in a minute, stumbles upon a crumbling chapel deep in the woods. It looks as if it hasn't been occupied for years, if not decades. Vines grow up and down its walls, and a little of the stained glass he could tell used to be in the windows remains. The steeple, which might have once risen far beyond even the great pine trees of this forest, has fallen down, lost and overtaken by the earth. Protagonist pushes the rubble blocking the door aside and steps in. Pews are overturned, and the remnants of pages from holy books scattered across the floor like dead leaves in autumn. He ventures forward, now impossibly curious as to why such a place exists and has been so thoroughly forgotten. when he comes across a skeleton. Its head is laid back against the head of a pew, but its hands remain clasped together. He looks around the body of the church and sees no other such corpses. On this skeleton are the tattered old robes of a common worker, and laying next to them a single silver coin for which a tithe may have been intended. Protagonist goes to pocket the coin, but thinks better of it, instead taking it into his hands and placing it upon the altar where, strangely undisturbed, a holy book remains open to a page that speaks about how the gods forget none of their faithful, even those who have been forgotten by their peers. Protagonist doesn't recognize the book, nor the symbols that have yet to be eroded off the pillars and walls of the church's interior, but he still pays his respect, leaving the book and the bones where they were, feeling it would be a bad idea to disturb the peace any further than he already had. As he turns to exit, he sees a beam of light from the afternoon shine down through a hole in the ceiling, across and through a window in the side of the church. He follows the beam and finds a natural, clear stream flowing just outside, from which he gets a much-needed drink of water. He looks once more upon the abandoned holy place before continuing on his journey. All of this is basically a throwaway little description I wrote up very briefly just for this, but I hope it gets across the ideas I'm going for here. A good environmental description can do a lot to set a tone and bring immersion, even without dialogue, internal or external. However, depending on your setting, this can be further enhanced by Part 3, Get the Little Things Right. Now, if you're writing in the modern-day world that we live in, or anything resembling a prediction of the future or some sci-fi, this section will apply slightly less. But if you're writing in essentially any setting that isn't your everyday reality, whether that be because in some way it represents the past, or represents a place or a people that you don't live in or around, you're going to want to ensure that your setting, be it historical or fantasy or what have you, is keeping in line with the ideologies, ideas, and everyday existence it is meant to represent. Now, this obviously is going to vary wildly depending on your setting, so this is going to just be about key universal concepts. So, as humans, our perspective on the world itself is greatly limited by whatever we see in our daily lives. We live in a hyper-online and hyper-global space, and spend tons of our time on it. And come on, I know you're on this platform a lot because you found me somehow. And while this means we probably have a better idea about what's going on in the rest of the world than our ancestors did even a generation or two back, I've found that this tends to give us the idea that we know what's up in these places because we watch a cool YouTuber from that place or watched a movie made there. These are obviously better than nothing, especially if that source you're pulling from conducts themselves responsibly, but obviously aren't a stand-in for actually going to and living in these places for some amount of time. I've had a few friends from Germany, for example, over the years. I mean, hell, my one patron is German, but just because of that, I would never claim to know what's going on in Germany unless I actually went there and lived it for a while. You might be wondering what this has to do with writing anything, especially fantasy. But what I just said about locations applies just as well to time. You can't authentically write about a place you haven't been or lived in unless you do a thorough amount of research on it. Live in the US and want to write about Japan? Research the hell out of it. Go there, live there, talk to Japanese people, and vice versa. Any American who's been around people from other countries long enough will know that they get stuff wrong about us too. It's pretty universal. But it is not unsolvable. I've definitely heard some people say you can't write about any place or time that you haven't grown up in, but I find that hopelessly reductive. You just need to do your honest due diligence to depict whatever it is authentically. The best example of that, in my mind, is yet another Cormac McCarthy novel. I swear I didn't do this on purpose, he just happened to have a perfect example for each of these concepts. And that novel would be Blood Meridian. Cormac McCarthy spent 15 years tracing out and following the path of the historical Glanton gang. He read primary sources, consulted all sorts of historical documents, and learned fluent Spanish just so he could use it in small parts of his dialogue. And as a result, Blood Meridian is one of the most authentically written historical fictions ever created. And I mean, I'm sure there's some percentage of you who've already had Wendigoon or some other YouTuber yell at you to read it, but here I am yelling at you to read it also. Anyway, you don't necessarily need to go quite as hard as McCarthy did when it comes to researching every little thing about a time and place. But when in doubt, more is more when it comes to getting it right. As a subtopic of this conversation, I'll talk about fantasy specifically as a genre, and that's because I am primarily, far and away, a fantasy writer. Given that fantasy can mean basically anything, this may not be a universal experience, but here's the angle at which I've tackled this sort of thing before. I have never concealed in any way that I am a massive fan of the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and that came about in part because of a separate existing interest in the Renaissance period of history, and in part because of Total War Warhammer. Given Warhammer Fantasy is very Renaissance-esque, rather than medieval with the exceptions of those stinking Bretonians, it naturally became one of my favorite settings, and inspired a fair amount of what I've ended up doing in my own stuff. However, you don't get an authentic Renaissance feeling in your own writing by looking at another fantasy setting that did that well. You have to go and learn about the real thing for yourself. And so I've spent a fair amount of time learning about the Renaissance. From everything to how pike and shot warfare worked, to when exactly upholstered furniture came into common use. It's often those 1 a.m. searches into when linoleum tiling started being used that will help seal the deal on making whatever you're writing about feel genuine. Though I do feel obligated to say, you don't want to go so far in the opposite direction that you grow paranoid of getting essentially meaningless details wrong, especially when your setting still has the plausible deniability of being fantasy, so don't let all of this stop you from actually getting stuff done. While there are other fantasy settings that try to pull very far away from reality, you can't base a universe on nothing, so when you do want to free yourself of the fetters of reality, you can at least ensure that you're doing it for a reason and with a purpose. If you find some fact about how medieval people lived, for example, it doesn't mean you have to depict it that way authentically. It just means that now you've given yourself the choice to do it authentically or to do it differently and have a reason for doing it so. And don't mistake any of what I'm saying for being something to limit your options. I'm only encouraging you to learn things so that the options that you do choose will be taken thoughtfully as opposed to in ignorance. But before we close out the video, I have one more slightly smaller topic to discuss, and that is part 4, speech patterns. Speech patterns in unconventional settings are one of those things where you really want to hit that Goldilocks zone. We as humans pay a lot of attention to the way that people speak, even if we don't do it consciously, and this is especially true in dialogue. When a character speaks in a way that doesn't make sense, it becomes incredibly obvious and often irritating to us as the audience. There is a tendency for people to underdo or overdo speech patterns when they want them to be different from our everyday conversations. Take the example of a generic medieval fantasy world, one that's fairly relaxed in its world building, but not quite at the level of a D&D session prepped 5 minutes before it started. So in this scenario, we have two nobles talking. With my obviously supreme acting skills, I will portray these 3 short exchanges, and you can figure out which one is well balanced.
What's up, man? You want to hang out later? No, man, I'm swamped out the ass. I do say, my dear old chum, I dare believe that this is indubitably quite the exquisitely fortuitous morn, prithee. Ho-hum, I readily concur. Let us not tarry, and forbid I neglect the preponderance of thine observation. Might we go out for a walk? The evening sun is rather pleasant, don't you think? A wonderful suggestion. Let us depart at once.
The trick here is that none of these, save the second really, is bad per se, except for how I just acted them. You just have to choose wisely dependent on your setting and take care not to appear too colloquial or modern in a setting that is meant to resemble the past, or to completely Flanderize the more formal speech patterns of such times, unless of course that's your goal for something comedic. Just try to be aware of what you're doing and match your dialogue to the setting. Even in very formal situations, audiences are never going to want to read something like that second example if it's meant to be taken seriously. Even if you're writing characters who speak eloquently, brevity is still going to work in your favor the majority of the time. Other than that, however, you'll get a feeling for it as you go, And while I can't say anything more specific if we want to keep this fairly universal, I want to plant the idea of thinking about that sort of thing in your mind. But with that, I think we've discussed world building and how to make it immersive alongside a few book recommendations and bad accents on my part. If you have any thoughts of your own about immersion or the general topics I covered, let me know about them in the comments. I hope you enjoyed, and since we're still small here at JBat, every like, subscription, and bell goes a long way. Anyway, if you want to hang out with my editor and I, we have a Discord, and if you're really crazy, we also have a Patreon, all of this being in the description below. Anyway, I've also got to thank Shadowrunner, our $10 patron and a knight of the Inner Circle. And remember, don't put the lucky coin in your pocket, or it'll just become another coin, which it is.